Before we get into introduction, just a bit about the upcoming chats. Next week, our guest will be strength training coach Will Ruth, who collaborates regularly with our recent guest, Coach Marlene Royal. His topic will focus on core strength training for masters and what the core is, how exactly these muscles function in the rowing stroke, and how we can strength train for improved performance and reduce risk of injuries. Upcoming sessions in November include the North Bay Rowing Club member founder Greg Saborin to discuss the history of and efforts to build a community boathouse. Our next chat will be with founder of Chaos Rowing in North Carolina, Felix Mullebach, to discuss sculling, building a great system, excuse me. And lastly, in November, we'll have Coach Neil Bergen-Roth to discuss understanding force curves to improve. And in early December, we'll have U.S. national team coxswain Colette Lucas Conwell. So feel free to contact me for more details and suggestions for possible topics and speakers for this venue. If you haven't done so already, and if you feel like it, if you'd like to type into the chat the group you're affiliated with and your location. And during our time with Arthur tonight, please type your questions into the chat so that I can refer back to them during the Q&A that will follow his talk. For Arthur's introduction, I first met Arthur, through his written voice in a little book he wrote with Rebecca Lawton in 2004 titled On Foot in Sonoma, 12 Walks in the Valley of the Moon. I fondly remember the delight in sharing it with my SSU chemistry teacher who had just moved here from India and was eager to explore the landscape. It was a most welcoming gesture to be able to share. He's published several books on regional history and historical ecology, including his most recent, which you may have seen, Where the World Begins, Sonoma Mountain Stories and Images, published by the nonprofit Sonoma Mountain Preservation in 2019. And I put a link to the book in the chat. The book weaves together diverse local voices, with Arthur's being central, and approaches the mountain as a living presence, a refuge for wildlife and natural systems, and a source of inspiration. Last year, I shared this book with my third graders while we explored early Sonoma history and the origin story of the Coast Miwok people. They were all keenly drawn in by the breathtaking images. It's really, really beautiful. I've come to appreciate the best part of Arthur's work is the joy it brings while sharing it, and I hope you experience that tonight. Arthur was the founder of Baseline Consulting and a recognized expert on regional history and historical ecology. He has been a guest lecturer at UC Davis and several California state universities and is certified by the state of California as a historical consultant. His background includes over 10 years as the Sonoma Ecology Center's historical ecologist, where he worked for clients ranging from private landowners to the Sonoma Land Trust, Sonoma County Water Agency, California Department of Fish and Game, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Arthur Dawson, to discuss Where the River Begins, Sonoma Mountain to the headwaters of our beloved Petaluma River. Welcome, Arthur, and thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jessica. That was I really appreciate your introduction, and it's nice to hear that the best part of this is the joy that this brings other people. That means a lot to me.
Nice.
So just to sort of how did I come to be here? I mean, you've heard sort of my little more of my standard background from Jessica, and I just want to throw in a little more of the personal side of how I ended up doing the kind of work I do, and that is back in the mid-90s, I heard Gary Snyder, the California poet, speak in Sonoma, and he said, our job is to become natives of where we live. That just resonated with me, and it set me on a whole series of things from, I also have taught a number of years with California poets in the schools, so I had a program about local places, local culture with school kids. As Jessica mentioned, I worked as a historical ecologist. So it's kind of branched out into all these different ways, but really it started, I mean, Gary Snyder gave me my career basically by saying that, and it just has kind of expanded out from there. So I'm really happy tonight to be able to share with you one of my favorite local treasures, and that is Sonoma Mountain. And one thing in the process of doing the book, Where the World Begins, is I pretty early on realized that I needed to think about, or I wanted to think about the mountain as a character in the landscape, that seemed to be the most accessible way to think about the mountain, rather than, you know, a bunch of geological facts or whatever. Really think about it as a character in the landscape. And I was very lucky to have some great co-authors, and we had photographs from many people, including Scott Hess and Ed Cooper, who's on the other side of Sonoma Mountain, pretty well-known Western photographer, Ulrich Kolbe, Richard Dale, who's the head of the Sonoma Ecology Center, and then also quite a few amateur photographers. We just sort of put out the word and had this wealth of images to work from. So I still love the pictures in the book. I haven't gotten tired, even though I've looked at them, you know, hundreds of times, some of them. So I'd like you to just invite you to think about the mountain that way. And, you know, one of the things that first drew me to the mountain was, you know, and there's a book called Dawn of the World. It's Coast Miwok stories. And one of the stories takes place on top of Sonoma Mountain. And I used to tell that to school kids, and maybe I will again, but I've gotten a little bit more hesitant to tell the story as the Coast Miwok people have become more of a visible presence in the county. I just feel like it's a little bit of cultural appropriation for me, a white guy, to tell their story about the creation on the mountain. But I will be talking a little bit about you know, things that I've learned from the native perspective, and you'll see how it's kind of woven into my view of things. So kind of putting all that together as a way to get started, I'd like to read a poem that I wrote that's called, about 15 years ago, and it's called Every Language a Landscape. And it starts with an epigram by Vitus Bremiev, who was poet geographer to Peter the Great. Every once in a while, I like to say a few of the old words out loud. Unu, Hutsi, Katati, Yalupa. To remind myself that everything once had a different name. To remember that for thousands of years, another language was spoken here, with glottal stops and vowel endings, and no use for the sound of R. Born out of flutes of fire, out of the invisible breath of the earth that is forever rising from the ground, longing for speech. It was a language unique to the people of this valley, a miracle of sound and meaning and memory that wrote itself invisibly on the living air, tracing a local alphabet of hilly M's, oak Y's, ducks weck-wecking over the sacred L's of waterfalls, the open mouth O's of baskets into which hot rocks est and disappeared into acorn soup. Unu, Hutsi, Katati, Yalupa. Every once in a while, it's good to hear the old words, to notice how strange my English sounds beside them, to remember that saying a place right is the work of millennia, and to remind myself that we still speak a foreign tongue. So that's just kind of my take on where we are as a culture here. We're just, you know, little babies in this landscape and still have a lot to learn. But there's a lot of joy in learning, and you know, that journey of trying to become a native or closer to being a native has been great, and I recommend it. Okay, we're going to start going through the slides if I can get this thing to operate. There we go. So I'm not going to spend really any time in the lower part of the river except for these first few slides that just show the southern part of Sonoma Mountain. And here's Ned may know where this is, where these geese are, if he wants to. We can find out later. That's okay. But you can see there's Sonoma Mountain. This is somewhere south of Petaluma, maybe along Lakeville Highway, somewhere in that area. And one of the amazing things about Sonoma Mountain is that, you know, it's not a very big mountain, but it sits in the middle of all these people. There's something like 250,000 people living within a dozen miles of the summit of Sonoma Mountain. And a lot of them probably couldn't even point to it if you asked them, but it's sort of sitting right there. And you know, you can see all this ring of cities that's around Sonoma Mountain. And that's part of its personality. It's kind of a trickster. It's kind of hiding in plain sight. And many people don't recognize it. Hopefully more than used to be, but it's a funny mountain that way. It doesn't have a sharp peak. So it's kind of, I like to say it doesn't have an ego. So here's Sonoma Mountain looking over Petaluma, kind of the lower parts of the mountain, probably up, this is probably up around Lafferty Ranch, if you're familiar with that area, which has some city-owned property on it, which eventually, hopefully will have some public access. So what I'd like to do is invite you to join me in a virtual stroll from the Petaluma River in more or less in downtown Petaluma, all the way up to the headwaters. And we'll be jumping around a little bit. So this isn't going to be a perfectly linear path, but just think of it that way, as starting from Petaluma and then beginning to head up the mountain. And something else to think about with Sonoma Mountain is that it actually has 3 watersheds that come off of it. So there's the Petaluma watershed. Jessica, give me a thumbs up if you can see my cursor. Okay, good. So here's the Petaluma watershed right there. And then this is actually the southern headwaters of the Russian River, which is kind of surprising. It's all the way down here on Sonoma Mountain. And then the east side, of course, is Sonoma Creek. So you have water that, if the rain falls in this area, it's going to go all the way into the Russian River and come out at Jenner on the Pacific Ocean. And if it comes off of the Petaluma River or the Sonoma Creek watershed, then it will end up in the bay and meet the ocean at the Golden Gate. So even though it's, you know, these are all close together, the water flows in many directions. And it also meets up with water from a good portion of the state of California. If you think of the water from Sonoma Mountain mingling with waters from the Sacramento River, and also all the waters from the Russian River that come all the way down from Mendocino County. It's a pretty good chunk of the state that mingles with water from Sonoma Mountain. And what we're going to be doing is, here's Petaluma, we're kind of heading up, and we're going to take a very brief detour up Adobe Creek, and then we're going to eventually end up going up Lehigh Creek and actually Copeland. We're going to check that out as well. So if you think about where does the river really begin? Well, it begins in the ocean, right? You know, the ocean evaporates and lifts the water up into the air, and then the wind blows it over the landscape, and then it falls as rain. And one thing about Sonoma Mountain is that it's not that high, but it's high enough that it catches a lot of rainfall. So you can see on this, this is kind of a hydrograph. The dark blue here is areas that get maybe 70 inches of rain in a year. And just 10 miles or less away, down by the bay, it only gets maybe 15 or 20 inches of rain a year. So it's really a remarkable difference between the lowlands here and upper Sonoma Mountain. Jack London has a story where he writes about riding a horse across sort of the northern part of Sonoma Mountain, and it's in August or September, and he says, you know, here it is, the end of the dry season, and the mountain is just leaking everywhere. There's just little rivulets of water coming out from the mountain. It's leaking like a sponge, is how he describes it. And that's another way I like to think of the mountain, is it's like a big sponge that just sits here and collects water from the clouds coming in off the Pacific. And these are just a few slides of water on the mountain. This is Whitney Falls, which is on Carriger Creek, which just flows into Sonoma Creek. But if any folks who are with us right now remember Bill Cordham, a Petaluma elder, he remembered hiking from Petaluma up over the top of the mountain and down to Whitney Falls for a good day hike when he was a kid, and then hiking back home, and the whole thing took something like 14 hours. It'd be a long way. But it's one of the most beautiful places on the mountain. So I'm gonna highlight a few places that aren't specifically in the Petaluma River watershed. And of course, all that water means that you know, people that live around the mountain want to catch that water for their own use. So this is also in Sonoma Valley, but this is a lake over at Eldridge. There's also up at Lafferty Ranch, there's a reservoir that's owned by the city of Petaluma for a city water supply. And this is hiking up Lafferty Ranch, looking out toward, I believe that's the Petaluma River right there, just before it goes into the bay. And then here's the lowlands around just east of Petaluma, at the base of Sonoma Mountain. And the water that goes into Lafferty eventually flows into Adobe Creek. And many of you may know that Casa Grande High School has a fish hatchery for Chinook salmon. And here they are with a Chinook from Adobe Creek, you know, right here in Petaluma. So now we're going to start heading north, and you know, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this kind of a scene. This, I would guess, it was taken from Petaluma Hill Road, or maybe Adobe Road, just east of Petaluma. Kind of, you go along the base of the hills. This is cattle country over here, so lots of open grassland. Going all the way back to Vallejo, you know, this is where he had his Petaluma Adobe over here, because this was the center of his cattle ranch, and there was just thousands of acres of good grazing in the lowlands and also up on the mountain. And then a little further north, here's the whole sweep of Sonoma Mountain from further up on Petaluma Hill Road, but still on the west side, just looking over at it. And as I mentioned, there's not really much of a high point. It's pretty tough to tell where the top of the mountain is from almost anywhere. Even USGS, when they put their first benchmark on the summit, they missed it literally by a mile. And so they had to relocate it years later. But there, you can find old maps that show the summit and not in the right place. And if anybody knows how to measure something, I would think USGS would be the people. So it's as I said, it's a trickster. It likes to fool us. So we're going to go all the way up. This is actually Copeland Creek, which normally flows into the Russian River. And it flows through the Sonoma State campus. So anybody who's familiar with Copeland Creek through SSU will be familiar with this creek. And if you go up, this is, let's see, what is this called? I think it's Roberts Road, and then this is Lehigh Road right here. And this is, and then Copeland Creek is right here following this riparian vegetation. And there's another little creek over here. And so this one, so Copeland Creek flows into the Russian River usually. And this little creek here, Roberts Creek, usually flows into the Russian River. So the divide between the Russian River and the Petaluma River is this very subtle little rise there. It's hardly anything. And in fact, it's so subtle that when we get a good flood, Lehigh Road floods out. Sometimes people can't get off the mountain because you know, boulders and things move onto the road. The county has a heck of a time trying to fix it. And here's somebody took a picture. This is Lehigh Road under this water right here. And it's flowing toward the Russian River right there. And it's flowing to the Petaluma River on this side. So, you know, it's right there on the divide. Now, you know, some people say, you know, it's supposed to flow into the Russian River, as if, you know, the water knew what it was supposed to do. But I've done some studies in this area, and if you look, here's Copeland Creek coming off of the mountain. And in 1867, the very first map of Sonoma County actually shows Copeland Creek splitting into two branches, one going down into the Petaluma River. This is Lehigh Creek right here. And the other one going off into these flatlands here, and eventually this water would end up going into the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which flows into the Russian River. So this is actually a pretty accurate map here from the best I can tell. And then here's, so in whenever this last time this was, well, 2005, this jumped its bank. So here's Copeland Creek, and here's where it jumped the bank and started flowing into the Petaluma River. And you can see this looks like kind of a stream bed right there. There's Lehigh Road again. And then this is some of the mapping I did, and you can see how close these two creeks come together. And these are all old channels, or I should say not old channels, because they will flow again when the water gets high enough. But there's a lot of connection between these two watersheds. So another trickster part of the mountain is that there's no absolute boundary between these two watersheds. It's a flexible kind of boundary there. And something else to think about the mountain's trickster nature is it has a lot of slumps on it. There's slumps up in Lafferty Park. This is a big slump that was on Sonoma Mountain Road that slumped after, I believe it was after the 2005 floods that we had, and completely blocked the road for about 3 years. They finally fixed it, but the whole road just started giving way. There's a lot of places like this on Sonoma Mountain. One of my nicknames for it is Old Slumpy, because it's got so many slumps, and the soil is very soft, and and all that water that it catches tends to create good conditions for slides. And then, as long as we're talking about natural disasters, I thought I would just touch on fire for a moment. This is actually a controlled burn up near the top of the mountain. Those are the radio towers at the top of the mountain there. And this is up at, and we're going to end up on this landscape at the end of this talk. This is up at a place called Mitsui Ranch, which is run by the Sonoma Mountain Ranch Preservation Foundation, which is, it's different than Sonoma Mountain Preservation. And I'll talk more about Sonoma Mountain Preservation toward the end of the talk. But this is controlled burning. But during the big fires in 2017, the fires came out of the Miacamas, swept over to Glen Ellen, burned a whole bunch of houses in my neighborhood, and burned over to Crane Canyon Park, burned the edge of that park. So it kind of touched on the west side of the mountain, but really in many ways, the mountain, from the best people can tell, seems to be a protective presence for Petaluma. Because these fires are often driven by these really strong north winds, and the mountain stands in the way of those winds, it seems to be a protective thing. So if you're a Petaluma resident, you can thank the mountain for being a lot safer than we are here in Glen Ellen. We've all got some PTSD over here, unfortunately. Okay, let's move on. And we're going to continue up Lehigh Road. This is technically, we're outside of the Petaluma River watershed, except during big rainstorms. And some of you have probably been up here. This is a place called Gravity Hill. And if you go up here, and I've never been totally sure if I did this right, but I may have been facing the wrong way. But if you're facing the correct direction on this stretch of road here, and you get your car stopped, and then you let off the brake, it'll start to roll, but it will look like it's rolling uphill. So it's this place where it seems as though the laws of physics have been suspended. And that's kind of a newer story about the mountain. Obviously, before we had wheeled vehicles, that wouldn't have happened. But interestingly, this is connected to some of the oldest stories on the mountain. Greg Saris, who's the chairman of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, who's also an author and wrote a book that I would highly recommend, How a Mountain Was Made. He refers to this location in his book as the place where two of the mythological characters from Coast Miwok lore, Answer Woman and Question Woman, hang out. And between the two of them, they know all the lore on the mountain, but they can only speak it if Question Woman knows all the stories, but she can only tell those stories if Answer Woman knows all the stories, and she can only tell them if Question Woman asks the questions of, how did this happen, or what's the story behind this? And Greg says that these two women, sometimes they appear as women hanging out along the fence here with long black hair, and sometimes they look like a pair of ravens. And in the old stories, there's really no difference between people and animals. And I would like to read or recite another poem. And this one actually comes from the Eskimo tradition. It was collected by an ethnographer back in about 100 years ago from an Eskimo shaman. But it really but it expresses something that people all over the world believed in the past and to some extent believe today. And it's called magic words. In the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could be an animal and an animal could be a human being. Sometimes they were people and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. That was the time when words were like magic. The human mind had mysterious powers. A word spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It would suddenly come alive, and what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. Nobody can explain this. That's just the way it was. So I love that. Just love that idea. You can find that in Western culture as well, and it's really all over the world. And so with that, I want to head up higher up on the mountain. And one of the things that I love about Sonoma Mountain, let's see, we'll follow a creek here for a moment, and this is basalt that's actually come up in these six-sided hexagonal sort of devil's postpile things. I believe this is Copeland Creek. But I want to head up the mountain, and as we get up higher on the mountain, we're really entering into a place where different rules apply than the human world. And by that I mean, well, I'll tell you just a real brief story. About 10 years ago, I was running up on the east side of Sonoma Mountain, and I heard something coming towards me through the bushes. Excuse me. And I stopped, turned around, and a mountain lion came out of the bushes. And it was coming after me. When it saw me, it stopped and kind of hesitated. And I put out my arms and I yelled at it, and eventually it went away, but it took a little while. And it scared the heck out of me, but I'm also really glad that the lions are up there, because it's a place where it kind of gives you perspective on being a human, where you can actually be prey, hopefully just temporarily and not with any fatal consequences, but it's a place to kind of remember our place as human beings. And I also think of the mountain as a place where the human and the natural world have remained on somewhat equal terms over time, where that's not so true in many other places nearby. So I'm just going to go through a few slides of animals that live up on the mountain. This is a coyote. The Coast Miwok Tales, Oye, the coyote man, was the one who went to the top of Sonoma Mountain and threw feathers up into the air, and wherever those feathers came down, the next day there were people living. So this is kind of our grandfather here is a coyote, or Oye. And Coyote, of course, is a trickster. He's considered a trickster figure. These are some sort of smaller trickster figures. I think of these. These are acorn woodpeckers. John Sheehy, I don't know if he's on. Oh, he is. Hey, John. And by the way, John put together a remarkable book with Scott Hess of photos and writing about a lot of stories about the Petaluma River, called On a River Winding Home. That's just a wonderful book that I would highly recommend. Anyway, I interviewed John for the mountain book, and he lives high up on the mountain, top of Lehigh Road, and he told me that the acorn woodpeckers, they'll come, they're kind of like a motorcycle gang that comes to his house and starts pounding on the walls. They just have this, this real attitude, and they're just, like, again, they're outside the human world. And that's one of the values of Sonoma Mountain. Here's some foxes, gray foxes. Ed Cooper lives high on the mountain over on the east side. Here's some mountain lion cubs that are being tracked by Bouverie Preserve. And even though this is probably over in the Miacamas, these lions range all over the place. So they come over onto Sonoma Mountain, and they get around, have big territories. And of course, one of their prime prey is deer, which is probably what the lion that came after me thought I was momentarily. It saw something running and thought I was a deer. So lions anywhere you find deer, you're likely to find mountain lions. And here's a Chinook salmon. This is actually in Sonoma Creek, but this water, may have come off of Sonoma Mountain, probably did come off of Sonoma Mountain. These are, 28, 30, 32 inches long, big fish. And we also have steelhead trout that come up the creeks on Sonoma Mountain. And here's a kestrel up at Mitsui Ranch. They have nesting boxes up there for kestrels. And here's an owl. I'm not sure exactly where this is, but. And if you're up there this time of year, you might see this is a maple, California maple that's changing color. So that's starting to happen up there on the mountain. This is just some lichen. This is by Ed Cooper's wife, Debbie Cooper. And something else you'll see this time of year are Buckeyes. They have this kind of Dr. Seuss-like fruit that hangs from the branches, and you can pull them down and they'll kind of bounce up and down. They're kind of a fun thing to see. And then pretty soon, hopefully, we're going to get some rain. So we're going to get some clouds moving in over Sonoma Mountain, and we'll start getting, creeks will start getting a bigger flow. This is that same waterfall that I showed earlier. This is Whitney Falls. But there are some very, very lush places on Sonoma Mountain, and there's springs almost all the way to the top. There's a spring near the top of the mountain that just gushes out water. And some people used to think that the water came all the way from maybe Shasta County because they couldn't really explain it any other way. I've talked to some water experts, and they think there's probably what they call a perched water table on top of the mountain. It's like a big sponge, and even a few hundred feet of water collected up there would be enough to create springs. And here's a Redwood Grove. I think this is Cooper's Grove over on the north side of the mountain. And this time of year also, you'll see mushrooms. Once the rain starts, see mushrooms starting to poke up through the duff. And another treasure of the mountain, this is the grandmother redwood over in Jack London State Park. Huge old growth redwood. It's about 14 feet in diameter. It's probably a couple thousand years old, and it just has this remarkable presence. And you can imagine in the old days, there were, dozens, if not hundreds of trees like this on certain parts of the mountain. So here's the rain coming in. And then eventually, a few months from now, we'll start getting flowers. Here's a fairy lantern, Douglas iris. These are pretty common up on the mountain. Sometimes you get these incredible displays of flowers that are just, Jeff Wilcox, who's the stewardship manager up at Mitsui Ranch, he said that sometimes it's so green it almost hurts your eyes. And it's true. Sometimes the colors are just almost beyond belief. We had to double check some of our photos for the book. They seemed like they were too green, and then it happened to be the same time of year, and I went outside and I go, nope, the camera actually was correct on the color on this. Mariposa lily, which is more toward the end of the spring. Here's some scarlet larkspur. And here's Buckeye in flower. So, on toward April, May, you'll get these beautiful, sweet-smelling flowers that will eventually create those Buckeyes that we saw earlier. And as you go higher on the mountain, you eventually start getting views out toward the bay. This is actually San Francisco from high up on the mountain. And this is the Bay Bridge right here. So you start becoming aware as you get higher up of people, all the people that are around the mountain. Although it's still kind of amazing that you can be up there and be surrounded by literally millions of people, and there's not that much evidence that they're there. So, people are, I really believe in putting people into the landscape. I think people are, we're part of the story. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about human beings on Sonoma Mountain. This is an old black oak that's right on the ridge, kind of at the end of the East Slope Trail. And I've been told that this tree was probably tended by native people. And the reason that the person that told me this came to that conclusion is because it's got all these really wide spreading branches, and black oaks were very important for acorns, and they were a very important tree, and they would be tended very carefully. And this tree's old enough that it very likely was tended by native people. And if we go back here, this is a map that was made in the early 20th century from the memories of native people, showing all the village sites that were remembered. And the mountain, so there's the city of Petaluma, and here is the village of Petaluma, which actually was over against the foot of the mountain. One of the interpretations of the word Petaluma is slopeback, which fits the way Petaluma Mountain, or the way Sonoma Mountain looks. If you look at it from a distance, it's kind of a long sloping backed ridge. And then here's the mountain here. The summit is somewhere up in this area. And what always strikes me about this map, and I'm sure it's missing a lot of villages, but even so, you know, before any Europeans got here, this was really a well-settled area. You know, and the people that came in, the Mexicans and the Americans, you know, they were really the second people here. And so I would just like to acknowledge the peoples that were here before us and all the caretaking that was done of the land, and just humbly recognize their long-term presence here on the landscape, and their recent resurgence, which makes me very hopeful. And then you might see, as you walk up on the upper parts of the mountain, you might see stone walls like this, which are very picturesque, but they may have a darker side. I've been told they may have been built by Chinese workers, or possibly by native slaves. It was still legal to have native slaves up until 1867 in California, and I've heard some people in the local tribe remember building, or they have ancestral memories of people building stone walls in Bennett Valley when they were still slaves. So you know, it's kind of a two-sided thing, seeing these remnants. So here's a pioneer cabin. This was built by the Asburys over on the east side of the mountain, who got here in the late 1840s. Came out from Missouri. Pretty typical pioneer story. Settled on the mountain, and then had a small farm. And here's someone who settled nearby. This is Redwood Thompson. He came out from Kentucky. He settled not too far from the Asburys, and he built a cabin, and it was burned down by Mexican vaqueros, who are either outlaws if you were an American in those days, or you might have been called freedom fighters if you were a Mexican who didn't like the American presence. He built a second cabin that was also burned down. And then the third time he built a cabin, it stayed. And he stayed there, and he raised a large family, and there's still members of his family on Sonoma Mountain 170 years later. So, you know, of the newcomers, this is the oldest family that I'm aware of. And here's kind of the same era. This is the Crane family. And this is looking sort of southeast over the slopes of Sonoma Mountain. And as I mentioned, you know, this side of the mountain has a lot of grassland, and this was true in Vallejo's time. It was true when this drawing was made in the 1870s. It's still largely true. And it encouraged, you know, a lot of cattle ranching, and that was really one of the big economic drivers over on the west side of the mountain. On the east side, we had things like, you know, big redwood forests and logging, and you know, it was a different set of circumstances, and so a little different culture evolved on either side of the mountain. And then one thing, once the railroads got here, which we're talking 1870s, 1880s, it got very easy to ship things out of Sonoma County, and Sonoma County became somewhat of a Middle East for the Bay Area. And this is Sonoma Mountain looking at the eastern slope, which today is completely covered with trees. In 1910, when this photo was taken, the whole upper part of the mountain, this is all grassland and mostly forest that had been cut down and then turned into charcoal or shipped off as firewood to cities in the Bay Area. And then, you know, as the trees came down, people moved in and you know, had farms, grazed cattle, started dairies. These photos are from Fred Berger, who's still living up on the mountain, another very old family on the mountain. I think that's his sister. And these two girls are picking plums, which were then dried and then shipped off. And there's Fred right there. He's still around, driving the family tractor. So lots of homesteads on the mountain. And then over on the east side, where there's lots of trees and even after a lot of the trees have been cut, there were still lots of places that people wanted to visit. So the trains brought in the tourists. And so Waldrew Heights is up near the top of Sonoma Mountain Road. And people would come to just enjoy the scenery and go hiking and go fishing and get away from the big city, which of course is still true. And then for some individuals, this is Neil Shepard, who's Jack London's great grandnephew, and he still he really enjoys hooking up his Clydesdales to older style farm equipment, and he has this plow play day up at Jack London State Park once a year, and he's just one of the iconic people on the mountain and just a great guy. And then just to introduce a few other individuals, this is James Swallow, also known as the Elder Swallow, who he was a preacher, and he settled high up on the mountain in an almost inaccessible place. And a voice told him that a congregation would show up. And it took about 30 years, but in the 70s, when there was the, I'm not quite sure what the best name to call it is, but the Jesus freaks, hippies and Jesus freaks started turning toward Christianity. They discovered him, and so there were huge religious services led by the Elder Swallow near the top of the mountain, with like 150 people attending in the 60s and 70s. So he achieved his vision, but it took, you know, almost his entire life. This is Kwang Roshi, who started the Zen Center, which is also near the top of Sonoma Mountain, or near the top of Sonoma Mountain Road. And he told me that Sonoma Mountain really is the center of the universe. He told me that he used to think that the sharp mountains like the Himalayas were really the center, but eventually he realized that the rounded peaks had been there longer, which geologically is not totally true, but I love this perspective. And so really the Zen Center is on the mountain that is the center of the world. This is Barbara McChesney, a well-known artist who lived right next door to Fairfield Osborne Preserve. And she may still be alive. Last I heard, she wasn't doing very well, and she was in a rest home. But she has her pieces have showings every once in a while, and I think some of her pieces are in at SSU and various places around the county and beyond. And as far as Fairfield Osborne, this is William and Joan Roth, who donated the land that's now Fairfield Osborne Preserve, and with the idea that it would be a place for scientific research, for education, environmental education. And it's become an amazing place. Claudia Luke is now running Fairfield Osborne, and there's all kinds of programs. I'm sure it's a little different right now, but and they do have days when the public can come visit. So this is also up off of Lehigh Road. And here's some students going off to a pond to check out some of the life in the pond. And this is Jeff Wilcox, who I mentioned earlier. He's the steward at Mitsui Ranch, and he also leads outdoor classes sometimes. And here he's showing a newt up high on Sonoma Mountain. So now we're coming up to the top of the mountain, And this is this is at sunrise. This is on the old Mitsui Ranch, which Jeff manages under the Sonoma Mountain Ranch Preservation Foundation. And so it gets more open up there. And when you get near the top, you really can't tell exactly where the top is, like I mentioned, because it's kind of this rolling upland that's a little reminiscent to me of the Altiplano in South America, just because you're on this raised landscape with just the sky above you. So you have these rolling hills, you have open savanna here. That's Bill Cordham in his later years hiking up there. He's the one I mentioned who conservationist who used to hike over to the falls. And then near the top of the mountain, you also get these amazing bay forests with these huge old trees. And apparently the bay nuts, Greg Sears told me that the bay nuts have some kind of a slightly psychoactive substance, kind of a stimulant, and that his people used to and probably still do gather these and roast them. And if you eat them, it's sort of like a good coffee buzz is how he described it. Haven't tried that one yet. And so now we're leaving the bay forest behind and going out into these grasslands. And this is probably more or less how it would look right now if you got up close to the top of Sonoma Mountain. And looking south, you can see there's Mount Tamalpais, and then some mountains in Marin. I think that might be Burdell right there. And another old name for Sonoma Mountain besides Petaluma is Unapais. And the ending Pais means mountain in Coast Miwok, and Tamalpais means Bay Mountain. At least this is one interpretation. And another old name for Sonoma Mountain is Unapais. So you can hear the mountain at the end, and the best interpretation that I could find for Una is a Buckeye. And there are, in certain places, there's a lot of Buckeyes on Sonoma Mountain. So another way to think of it would be Buckeye Mountain, which are edible if they're treated right. And then you get to the top, and now we're looking north up toward Mount St. Helena. And on a really good day, you can see Snow Mountain up in Mendocino County. And you know, one thing about Sonoma Mountain, I lived next to it for over 20 years before I ever got to the summit. It was private property. And even though I have been known to trespass, I never quite trespassed up that far. And you get to the top of Sonoma Mountain, and here's this seemingly unassuming peak, and it's got this $1 million view. It's kind of like discovering that your unassuming neighbor is a Nobel Prize winner. Just an amazing view up there, and this is going to be open to the public fairly soon. County Parks is working on the access to the summit. Right now it's still off limits, but County Parks is working on that. And now I'd like to introduce two people who I knew pretty well, and one of them is still around. And they're right on the summit of Sonoma Mountain. That's Pat Elliott, and this is Mickey Cook. And they are two of the founders of Sonoma Mountain Preservation, which is an organization that I'm very involved with. And the book that we mentioned was put out by Sonoma Mountain Preservation. And they helped found Sonoma Mountain Preservation back in about 1993. So we're between our 25th and our 30th birthday now. And I'll tell you just a very short story about how the top of the mountain came to be protected. Like I said, it was private property. And Pat and Mickey each have a daughter. Mickey's daughter was Kirsten Lindquist. She's unfortunately no longer around. And Pat's daughter is Wendy Elliott, who just retired a few days ago from the Sonoma Land Trust. And Kirsten was a real estate agent. And she found out that the top of the mountain was for sale. And so she called up Wendy, Pat's daughter, and said, Wendy, we have got to get the top of the mountain. I mean, we have to find a way to purchase this through the Land Trust and the Open Space District. We've got to do it for the moms, because they knew how much the mountain meant to their moms. And it meant a lot to them as well, but that's how they put it. We've got to do this for the moms. So whenever I'm up there, I think about Pat and Mickey and these amazing women who started Sonoma Mountain Preservation. And we've done a lot over 25 years, and we're working, continuing to work on preserving the scenic, agricultural, and natural beauty and value of Sonoma Mountain, and encouraging people to engage with the landscape and become stewards, and also increase their local sense of place. And there's Pat. Pat, unfortunately, she passed away about 3 years ago. She was in her late 80s, very vigorous till right till the end. The last time I ever talked to her, she was in the hospital, and she said, "Arthur, how's the book coming?" And that's the only thing she wanted to know, is how's the book coming? So she was really behind. The book is dedicated to her, by the way. And Mickey's still around. She's going to be 90 in the spring. An amazing lady. Lived on Sonoma Mountain starting in the 1940s. Her dad bought some property in Glen Ellen, and just another very vigorous elder who's just done a tremendous amount for the community and for the mountain. And now Sonoma Mountain Preservation ends up working with lots of different partners. So we can't take credit for all of this, but Sonoma Mountain Preservation certainly has had a hand in helping preserve a lot of parcels on the mountain. And here you can see, these are all the lands that are protected in one way or another, whether it's state parks. Fairfield Osborne is owned by the state of California through Sonoma State. North Sonoma Mountain Regional Park is owned by the county. And then these are lands, the darker green are lands that are still privately owned, but have conservation easements. So when Sonoma Mountain Preservation started in 1993, I should have looked up the details on this, but I believe it was maybe a quarter as much protected land at that time. So really an astounding amount of change and protection has happened in the last 25 to 30 years. So I want to end with this, and then one more poem. Really the reason that we believe Sonoma Mountain is worth preserving is so that we can pass on some things that are really important to the younger generation. We can pass on a place that has lots of natural beauty and natural values, a place where people can go to find some solitude and some solace when the world down below gets a little too busy. A place for people to get perspective on their lives. So we really want to see the mountain to be that place for as long into the future as it can be. And I'm going to end here with, like I said, one more poem. And so this is the fog that comes in, sweeps in from the west. And those of you in Petaluma know this fog well. And I've been told that people in Petaluma don't have barbecues because it's too cold and foggy in the summertime to have a barbecue. And if you're on top of the mountain, you will see this fog come in sometimes. And over in Glen Ellen, it's a little different. We'll see the fog, but just kind of on the top of the ridge. It doesn't come down to ground level, and it's just a different experience. So another way that the mountain acts as a character in the landscape is by, the weather is different on the two sides of the mountain. And if you get a chance to drive around Sonoma Mountain sometime on a day like this, you can easily change the weather pretty quickly. So this is another poem that I wrote. This will be the end of the program here. This is called Ocean, and starts out with an epigram by Dylan Thomas. And he says, "And I sang in my chains like the sea. See how at sunset the western ridges are crowned with extra light, how the fog slips an arm over the mountain's hip and slides its fingers into the moist hollows. Take these as a sign that somewhere in the distance something is overflowing, pouring itself over and over again onto dry land. From the silence of 30 miles, you will begin to hear it, like a memory from the womb, a steady, constant pulsing, the vibration of another heart out there, beating in solitude beyond the hills." So thank you for joining me, and I hope you got a little sense of Sonoma Mountain as a character in the landscape, but also maybe something of its heart qualities and what an amazing place it is.
Nice. Does anybody have any questions for Arthur or any follow-up comments? And you're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like. That was really nice, Arthur.
Thank you.
I especially appreciate the poetry intermingled into all of it.
Oh, thank you.
Really delightful. Yeah.
Hey, Arthur.
Yeah.
I may have missed it at the beginning, but what is the current status of the Lafferty?
That's a complicated question that I'm going to punt it a little bit, but as I understand it, it's closer than ever to having access. That's the best I can tell you.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think you could who would be the best person to talk to? If I'll tell you what, if you want, I can send you an email link to Matt McGuire, who's really been up on the Friends of the Lafferty group, and he can tell you the latest. So maybe Jessica can send out my email, and I'll be happy to forward that on to him.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
I had two questions.
Uh-huh.
My first question was, I missed the first poem or the first reading that you did. I just missed the source of that.
That was me. I wrote that.
That was you. Oh, lovely. And is that from the book?
It's from another book. This is a book of poetry that I published back in 2005 called Saying This Place Right. Poems
Lovely. Okay.
and Language. And let me just, as I'm doing a little book thing here, here's the book that was published by Sonoma Mountain Preservation. And as I mentioned, I got to be the lead author, but it really was a community effort in so many ways. Lots of photographers, several other writers who I mentioned earlier. People supported it financially. It was a real joy to do it as a community effort. So that was an honor for me. And what was your other question?
Oh, thank you. My second question was just a personal question. I was just wondering what your favorite spot on the mountain is.
That's a hard one to answer, but certainly the summit is pretty amazing. I also really like Jack London, and the grandmother redwood tree is a really special place. And the North Slope Trail, if you have a chance to do that, if you like to hike, it's a really good hike. And the park system runs a shuttle. It might still be running, where you can drop your car at one end and then hike to the other end and then take the shuttle back. So it goes between the North Slope Trailhead and Jack London State Park. And so it's miles one way, which is a very nice day hike. 14 miles is doable, but it's a much bigger commitment.
And that starts at that goes from the the North Slope Trailhead.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Nice. That was my question as well. Thank you.
One of my dreams someday would be to have a trail that you could circle the mountain on. There's a lot. There's a lot of things that would need to happen, and there's a lot of. But slowly the mountain is. It's becoming more protected. Personally, speaking just for myself, I think it'd be great if about half the mountain were protected. I don't have any problem with people owning property up there. I mean, it's part of the story. Mm-hmm. But it would be great if we got half the landscape protected. I think that would probably be enough to preserve the values I care about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Did you have something, Ned?
Yeah, just a little bit. I love this, what you told us, Arthur, and your perspective. I feel so lucky because I was with Scott Hess and John Sheehy when Scott got the picture of the basalt formations and
yeah.
And when Bill Cordham and the others and Matt McGuire and others got us to the one day we could walk to the summit once up the Petaluma side. And those views of Burdell and Tamalpais and onto the Golden Gate or the Bay Bridge towers. Just amazing to see the connections of stuff we knew so well, but it all comes together. And then finally, I was thinking of back to your character story. We've got some beautiful pictures from when we first got together. I saw that picture of the middle reach of the Petaluma River. We had pictures of people in their boats racing back to Petaluma. And what was intriguing, there were telephoto pictures, what was intriguing was they just looked like they were protected by Sonoma Mountain. That big mass rising behind the scullers there. Just so impressive to see. And it sort of works back into part of your story and the character of that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I feel that myself. And it's, after this is a little different, but kind of in the same vein as after the fires of 2017, the mountain was really a place that I could go that hadn't changed. London, it was under threat, but it didn't really burn up into the park. And so I could hike a trail there, while my neighborhood was vastly different, the mountain had not changed. And that was a relief to have that as an escape. And a lot of animals did the same thing. There were tons of birds. You'd drive Sonoma Mountain Road after the fire, and all the telephone wires were just filled with birds. There were many more than you usually would see. And there were other stories about coyotes showing up and all sorts of things. The animals were taking refuge as well.
Right.
Nice. Cool. Well, anybody else? Any last comments or questions anybody has?
We can wait another minute, and then I'll just have one last invitation before we sign off.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm vice chair for Sonoma Mountain Preservation, and we're working to preserve the mountain and preserve the values that we care about on Sonoma Mountain. And so if you're interested in getting to know more about Sonoma Mountain or getting involved, please check out our website, easy to remember, sonomamountain.org. And there's many ways to get involved. We have volunteer opportunities. We have a new board we're just putting together. I'm getting together our annual journal, which will go out in probably in a couple of weeks, well, maybe a little longer, but in a few weeks. It's going to talk about climate change on Sonoma Mountain. So that's going to be interesting. We're starting to do possibly some educational outreach by partnering with other organizations like the Ecology Center. And I was just talking with Jessica because she's a third grade teacher. So anyway, we're looking for ways to involve more and more of the community in Sonoma Mountain. It's putting out the book was really heartening because we discovered just how many people really care about Sonoma Mountain. And so I invite all of you to get involved in whatever way you like, even if it's just looking up at the mountain every once in a while and knowing what's up here.
Sounds great. Great.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and it's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Arthur. It's been really wonderful.
Beautiful.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So good night, everybody, and have a lovely week. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to help you.